Good afternoon, and welcome brothers, friends, and guests. On behalf of King David's Lodge, my name is Dean Clark, current master of the lodge. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this special event that has been some years in the making. As often is the case, you don't always know what treasures lie in your own house. As the saying goes, out of sight, out of mind. This was the case for the painting we will be unveiling today. Somehow, it had been taken down and stored in the basement or the vault of our building. And once it was discovered, it was brought to the lodge that this painting was a piece of art that was worthy of restoration and a treasure that should be preserved for the future. We did discover, even from old pictures, that it was at one time displayed in our dining room. Now, we are privileged to have with us the craftspeople responsible for the restoration, representatives from the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, our own SLO History Center, who can explain much more of the details much, much better than I. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you enjoy our program as we pay tribute to our inaugural president, one of our most prominent Masons, on this very special day of remembrance. Thank you. And I'll introduce most worshipful, worshipful past master of this lodge, Robert Sachs, who was much more hands-on in putting this whole event together.
Thank you, Worship. I always, I love the way you summarize things. It really, it's really very quite alive when you do it, so thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for coming and to this event, which again has been in the making for about 1.5 to 2 years. Probably would have happened a little bit sooner had we not been shut down originally. In fact, this painting we were hoping to have done for our sesquicentennial last year, but when we realized that we weren't really going to be able to do a live event, it didn't make much sense trying to unveil a really beautiful picture just virtually. It'd be like looking at it in a magazine, okay? So anyway, Worshipful Dean is correct in talking about the fact that it had been downstairs in our vault, and it was mainly because of the fact that over the years, King David's has moved several times. And in the process of it moving, in the process of it being in a time when there was leaded gas, at a time when guys used to smoke cigars all over the lodge. Over time, the painting got kicked around a bit, got a little bit, let's say, encrusted with petroleum and whatever. So what happened was it was stored. I'm not sure exactly when it was decided to put it down in the vault. And the vault is really, it sounds really exotic. Really what it is it's a cinder block hole in the wall. And that's what it is. So fortunately, I never saw any mice in there, who may have made the painting worse. There were never any mice in there, but it was definitely kind of musty. And what I did was when we were doing the Dorn Pyramid project as well as the sesquicentennial, I was working with one of the presenters, Joe Carotenuti, from the History Center, to look at some of the records for the city. And every time I went in, I would see this huge picture, and I would move it to one side, and I would get the book I wanted, put the book back in, and then take it and move the painting back to where it was. Until finally I got tired of just moving it, and I began to wonder more about it. And at one point, and this is sadly, one of the presenters that is not here today, his name is Dr. James Moore. And what happened was, was the director of the Albuquerque Museum, and a friend of mine, and so he took him down to the vault, and he looked at this painting and said, oh my goodness, this is a painting of Leon Trousset. And Leon Trousset was one of the most famous itinerant artists of the 18th century or 19th century who traveled around in the Southwest. He said, you really need to do something about this. About 3 weeks later, we had our installation of Worshipful Andrew Brown, and during that time, Worshipful Russ Giovanni was here, I took him downstairs. He looked at it and said, you know, you should probably take a picture of this and send it to the Washington Masonic National Museum. So what I did was I took a picture on my phone and I sent it, and I said, if you're interested in wanting to talk about this, just let me know. Well, I got a call within a half an hour, because what happened was, and this was Worshipful Shawn Eyer, who's going to be also presenting from the National Masonic Museum. And he saw and said, listen, you need to get this conserved. And so what happened was, they were talking about conserving in Washington, but then we heard that the Santa Barbara Lodge did some conservation work with a company down in Santa Barbara, the Fine Arts Conservation Laboratories, who their main conservator, Scott Haskins, is here, who's also going to be doing a presentation. So right now what we've got is, I would say, is like the A-team of who put it all together. We've got Shawn Eyer, we've got Scott Haskins, we've got the historians, Carotenuti, Marilyn, Darnell, and then also Thomas from Kessler from the Slow History Center. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this now on to Marilyn Darnell for her presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. I really appreciate the introduction, and I'm very, very pleased to be here to spend this time with you this afternoon. This is a period of time that is very historic for San Luis Obispo, as we will find out. I will do my best in describing San Luis Obispo in 1870 in these 20-plus minutes that I have with you all. I have chosen some visuals that Thomas is going to, so you might actually, you can hear me. You don't need to look at me. Go ahead and look at those. They'll kind of, there are only about a dozen or so, 11 or 12 of them, but they will kind of where the interest is, I think. Many of the names that you will see or hear were Masons in commemoration of King David's Lodge of 1870. In fact, this first photo is a page from the minutes of the first meeting of the Lodge in 1870. The second, slide B, is the close-up of the names. So to describe what was going on in San Luis Obispo, the San Luis Obispo County was in a state of transition in 1870 due to drought, the Land Act, and an influx of people. The painted panorama named View of San Luis Obispo, bearing the signature of El Trousset, portrays the era of today's presentation and was used as inspiration, while the Tribune provided many details for our imaginary tour around town that we will take in a few minutes. Two droughts in the preceding decade continued as 1870 began. The Department of Agriculture estimated the losses in 1869 to be $20 million. The county's major industry of cattle was decimated. Some ranchers had mercifully driven their cattle over cliffs, for not a blade of grass or grain grew. Many farmers not only lost their livelihood, but their homes. In January, Auditor Charles E. Dana let the people know that he had received the delinquent tax list for 1869, and those on the list had 21 days to pay their bill to Treasurer Muller or suffer the consequences. The Land Act required landowners on Spanish or Mexican land grants to prove ownership. If those lands were sold, they were sold cheap and divided, providing opportunities to farmers, including poor dairy farmers. An example of one family's experience in proving their ownership was that of Victor Linares. The governor of Mexico's Alta California, Juan Bautista Alvarado, granted Victor Linares what became known as Ranchita de Santa Fe, where the now historic Octagon Barn is located. 10 years later, he applied for a patent deed that took 14 years for his widow, Michaela, to receive. Dairy farms were replacing cattle ranches from San Simeon to Nipomo, as the Central Coast was gaining a reputation as cow heaven, dubbed by the Steele brothers of Marin County, who brought their award-winning cows, cheese-making know-how, and their headquarters here. Butter was produced and exported using the ocean runway to San Francisco and abroad. In San Francisco, the butter was destined for the tables of fine dining. The conveniences of life were few. The 4,772 residents of San Luis Obispo did not have electricity or even conceive it, though Thomas Edison would discover it before the decade ended. Gas and water works were yet in the future. But it was only 1 year before the first bank opened, therefore limiting and eliminating trips necessary to San Francisco. Outhouses and chamber pots were the toilets of the day, for there was no sewer system. There were no paved streets or sidewalks. Adobe was hand-formed into bricks, and today many structures survive, such as Mission's San Luis Obispo, pictured here, and San Miguel, as well as Adobe's Sauer, Murray, La Loma, Dalladé, and Hayes Latimer, to name a few. Numerical addresses were not in use, as businesses, ranches, and farms were generally known by the family name, or by the Spanish or Mexican land grant on which they lived. San Luis Obispo County was one of the original 27 counties of California and was named for the mission founded by Father Junipero Serra of Spain. The church was built according to Vatican law, which states that churches were to be built as tall as the tallest tree in the area. The 50 to 60-foot pine dictated the height of the walls of Mission San Luis Obispo. The influx of people was largely made up of Portuguese from the Azore Islands that entered through the port of San Francisco, while others came from Germany, Denmark, and Prussia, as well as from other states. What they had in common were skills to build the dairy industry and the county. The Portuguese were poor farmers familiar with milking cows on their farms, but they had no opportunity in their homeland. They worked for years, often decades, before they could afford their own place. They learned that America offered them the promise of a better life because the ships from the U.S. stopped regularly in their ports, carrying the news that fertile land could be had cheap. Word arrived that the U.S. dairy industry had a greater value than wheat, hay, or cotton that year. Letters from family and friends urged them, as they were already profiting from the industry. San Luis Obispo consequently was thrown into a bit of a housing crisis. Lumber was locally resourced, as well as brought in by steamship or other seafaring transport, such as a schooner, being a wooden ship with a number of sails with two or more masts. Lumber yards, such as Schwartz, Harford and Company, located themselves conveniently near the wharf. The Pacific Transportation Company and the Southern Packet Line routinely serviced San Luis Obispo and San Simeon, carrying passengers and imports, as well as exporting county goods. Passengers were able to venture south to Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, and San Diego, or north to San Simeon, Monterey, Santa Cruz, San Francisco, and points beyond. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays at 7 o'clock in the morning, David S. Miller's Cambria Stage Line, carrying the U.S. Mail, Wells Fargo and Companies, and Pacific Union Expresses, left San Luis Obispo for Cambria, arriving at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a journey that totaled 8 hours. Today, that same distance takes us, what, about 45 minutes? In turn, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, the stage would leave Cambria for San Luis Obispo. Fare each way cost $3, the cost of a barrel of flour. There was no Highway 1, for it took another 50 years to start. Of the county's 14 schools, under Superintendent Forrester in 1870, it was reported that Mission District, which includes this area, had a total of 140 pupils, although the daily attendance was more like 108. 76 students were in grammar school and 64 in primary school. On March 4, the state of California allocated the county a little over $2,000 between the 14 schools, and just over $200 to their libraries. Postmaster Alexander Murray sold school books, along with periodicals, magazines from back east, in his shop on Monterey Street, the fast-growing thoroughfare of business of the new town. The thoroughfare spanned Monterey Street from Nipomo to Santa Rosa Street. And now for our imaginary walking tour. We'll begin at the center of town, in front of Mission San Luis Obispo, which I'm sure you can all see. This was my own photograph, but lighting be what it was. I apologize. So to help orient you from Leon's work, I cropped this out and got this close up, because in the original it is very difficult to see that. So the street that you see is Chorro. Behind the Mission is Palm Street. The Mission takes up the majority of the block to Palm Street, as you can see. The light-colored building on the other side of Chorro with 4 windows, it's the long white building to the left of the flag and down, you can see that. It's the only one with 4 windows and a black sign with white writing. That is looking at Monterey Street, just to orient you. Now to return to the Mission. Facing it were McFarland and Manel's Art Gallery and Samuel Burge's French Hotel and Restaurant, where board and lodging with spring beds could be had for $6 a week. Ah Lewis from China was working in this and other restaurants that year. The adobe of Walter Murray, attorney, notary, and publisher of the Tribune, which began in 1869, and it is the top photograph that you can see. And of course that looks very different than today, because it's right down to the adobe. It faces the Mission to this day, as you know. Michael Henderson drew up building plans and specifications to order in his office in Murray's building. Pictured also here is the sour adobe that was expanded just as the Murray was. Across Churro from the Mission, we could purchase fresh bread, pies, and cakes any day of the week from baker and confectioner Christian Sauer. He would even take orders for fancy cakes and bake a wedding cake with little notice. Some of those couples were married by Justice of the Peace Simler or Choate. In this block of Churro, George Sauer co-owned the billiard hall, and Lazar's sold dry goods. Excuse me. Continuing on Monterey Street, merchants Isaac Levy, Henry Lubliner, Ernest Cerf, and Isaac Goldtree of the Goldtree Brothers did business on the corner of Churro. Isaac was the family's primary connection for their wholesale retail merchandising in San Francisco and Monterey, as well as San Luis Obispo. Brizzolaras that you can barely see if you look down on the right-hand side of the page, the big letters of merchandise, above that, that's the ad for Brizzolara. Now his mercantile sat across from the Goldtree Brothers, as did San Luis Meat Market, where a variety of cuts of beef and pork could be purchased. Continuing down the thoroughfare, although now in no particular order, for their locations are unclear, A. Williamson offered his services as a sheet iron worker from his stove and home furnishings dealership. If groceries, clothing, hardware, or paints were on your shopping list, they could be found at L. Schwartz and Company, with the post office nearby. Simon Krog made new clothing and did repairs using his French tailoring skills, especially for boys and gents, opposite C. Glasser and Company in the Pico building. Call's building was home to J.W. Marcus, who had his dental office upstairs, while M. Pepperman created and repaired watches and jewelry, in addition to selling silverware and children's toys. The sales office of Schwartz, Harford and Company was convenient for shoppers to place their orders in town rather than having to go to the lumberyard at People's Wharf. If one's sweet tooth needed soothing, baker and confectioner P. Kazassis prepared a variety of pies and pastry while also selling wine, liquor, and cigars in his shop. Alcoholic beverages, in fact, could easily be purchased in numerous businesses throughout the thoroughfare. Now this is a good place to talk about county business because we are standing in front of Casa Grande, where court was held. The red-painted jail, built 9 years before, is across Santa Rosa Street and up several paces. San Luis Obispo County officials included Coroner Frederick Ott, District Attorney N.D. Witt, practiced law in all the courts of the 1st Judicial District, with his office in the editorial room of the Democratic Standard in the Call building. Judge William L. Beebe conducted court on the first Monday of March, June, September, and December. Jose de la Guerra was sheriff. J.J. Schifferly and G.W. Barnes were constables in San Luis Obispo, whereas George Lingo was in San Simeon, William Rutzel in Oro, and Thomas Carroll in Salinas. Well, we've reached the end of Monterey Street, and our tour, as we see opposite Brower's blacksmith shop, sat Mr. Henry Francis' livery, where one could rent a buggy, carriage, or horse, and where farmers could corral and water their horses while in town. In this celebratory year of 1870 for the Masons, I offer these details. Levi Ratcliffe, a 27-year-old teacher from Maine, obtained the charter for King David's Lodge 209 in San Luis Obispo. Builder and carpenter Michael Henderson, a 37-year-old Scot, gained leadership. The lodge counted Archibald Jessic, Horatio Remlaw, the 30-year-old owner of the Tribune, and Irish wharfinger David Mulliff amongst their membership. Members of the farming community were Irvin Johnson and Bryce Patrick from Kentucky, William Freeborn from Ohio, William Jackson of Tennessee, New Yorker David Eli, and James Blackburn, a 43-year-old Virginian. Other members were Prussian Simon Kralik, 35 years old, and Joseph Fisher, a 41-year-old German gunsmith. Merchandising was expanding during 1870, with members William Harriman from Maine and several 20-somethings, including Frenchmen Ernest Cerf, James Sutherland, a miller, and Prussians Isaac Goldtree and Henry Lubliner. Members of the Lodge of the legal profession were N.D. Witt of New York, 43-year-old Englishman Walter Murray, and 32-year-old W.W. Hayes. Sarah Hayes and her husband, William Hayes, have their names in the annals of San Luis Obispo history, for she was the first English-speaking woman in town, and the second in the county. William was Dr. Hayes, the first permanent physician and surgeon in San Luis Obispo. They resided on Monterey Street. You can see their adobe here. His office was in the Sour Adobe on Choro, and he kept hours at the Eagle Drugstore, where one could obtain brandy, whiskey, gin, and rum for medicinal purposes. Dr. Hayes later assisted in selecting the corner of Nipomo and Pismo Streets as the permanent site for the Episcopal congregation, and with Sarah, held the first Sunday school classes in their home. In closing, Trousset's painting of View of San Luis Obispo depicts a small rural town, nicely laid out with dirt streets and unpretentious architecture. Picket and rail fences surrounded by nature with two volcanic peaks in the background. Research reveals a population of multi-ethnics, varied backgrounds, and diverse skills. Yet they shared the belief that San Luis Obispo held the promise of tomorrow. Here could be found a community of hardworking people, growing in the American spirit that began with the first ships arriving from abroad that our founding fathers expanded on. San Luis Obispo today is rich in heritage because of those who came here before the gold rush, when this land was ruled by Mexico, when California became a state, and when the county transitioned from ranchos to dairy industry. It was those hopefuls, those visionaries, those farmers and entrepreneurs that believed in their individual rights and their desire for a better life that saw San Luis Obispo through, up, and over the devastations of the 1860s, that the community of San Luis Obispo became what we know today as a cradle of new ideas, possibility, and success. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And now we're going to have Joe Carotenuti, who's going to talk about more about the city, but also about Leon Trousset.
Thank you very much. Let me get my notes. Marilyn is always a hard act to follow. We've done various programs together. So I'll do my best by starting off thanking King David's Lodge for inviting me and allowing me to do the research and so forth on Leon, among other things. You know, one of the most joys of growing up for me was in the days when we played games, usually in the neighborhood somewhere. My mother had a golden rule. She would stand at the front door and yell my name, and I better hear it. Other than that, I was pretty free to roam. And my friends loved to play hopscotch. And I would lift one leg and the other would turn into jello. So I wasn't very good at hopscotch. Forget jump rope, because my feet simply didn't communicate with each other. And I couldn't judge the distance between my hand and the ball in volleyball, ping pong, let alone baseball. And as a participant of local contests, I was a dropout, except with hide and seek. And now there was my sport. Since I could rarely find anything big enough to hide behind with my childhood girth, I excelled at being the it. I think most of us know who it was. And I was it. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed looking around, finding, tagging people, and it would only last once, because then I would be it again. And I was very good at it, except for my brother Jack. And Jack didn't hide behind trees, he climbed them. And I wasn't going to commit suicide trying to tag him up there. Little did I realize that this was the beginning of two of my life avocations, one in law and one in history. In law, you must find the facts and tag them. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt requires a case composed of facts verified in as many ways as possible. And the attorneys here know that, and judges especially. And it needs to be strong enough to convince others of their truth. Maybes just don't work. In history, however, the past will also dare you to find it. There are vast oceans of maybes, and if you're not careful, you drown in a sea of doubt. So, discussing San Luis Obispo and artist Leon Trousset in 1870 just can't start in 1870. Now, fear not. I'll start in 1850, and even then, I already started with an article in last month's Central Coast Journal on the military governors. Let me show you. It's in this issue. And let me hold this. The military governors of California. We don't think of the military as governors, and they weren't. The title is a little misleading. They never were governors. And they're imitating a lot of other men along the way who thought they were governors. But the military men were here in 1846, and they stayed until statehood. So 1850, before that, from 1846 to 1850, we are really in a military governance, if you want to call it. There was very little governance. It was a very disorganized time. And in the middle of all of that, if you can imagine, there is a social tsunami that was called the gold rush. From far and wide, the vast numbers, avalanche of humanity came into California, poured into especially the San Francisco, Sacramento area, searching for El Dorado. And many of the folks that we're talking about came then to search for a future, to search for a life beyond wherever they came from. It was a very dangerous journey. It took years, sometime. There were many casualties, but gold has been a fascination of humanity from the very beginning. And in that humanity that showed up, imagine wherever you live today, wherever you will put down your head tonight to rest, in whatever space you have, whether it's an apartment or a house or whatever, just imagine when you go home, there'll be 50 other people there, and you have to take care of them. You can't evict them. There is no law that allows you to do so. And that's California in 1848 and 50. So, SLO County and community are still now a part of California. But for all intents and purposes, California centered itself around a relatively small area today that we would call San Francisco and Sacramento. So there are those who tried to get gold from the gold fields. Most were unsuccessful. And some decided that if they couldn't mine for gold, they would take yours. And so California becomes a very dangerous place. The 1850s in American history, and certainly in California history, are some of the most dangerous years dangerous decades in all of our history. So folks here braved each day, hoping that the next morning would come. They and their families would be fed, crops and cattle survived, and there was some hope for a future. In the midst of all of this chaos, order needed to be heard, but politics was not a consuming interest. Fear not, I wrote about some of this in another booklet that is available, and I hope you will take some home. It's the only one that's ever been done. It's from a legal viewpoint, how we became San Luis Obispo County and community. It looks like this. What's interesting, I hope everything's interesting in it, but my wife tells me differently about some of my writing. This is an image by Henry Miller. Now, Henry Miller came here in 1856, and he sketches San Luis Obispo, and that's how he made his living, sketching along the way. And if you see a book of Henry Miller sketches. You see different communities. They're really fascinating. And this is in Bancroft. But you'll see much of the same that Leon is going to do some years later. So please take one home with you. Okay. Over the years, for the journal, I've done over 200 articles now, and I've covered bits and pieces of people here and there and elsewhere. So in putting this together, part of me wants to go wandering off on a tangent here. Part of me, when Marilyn's talking, I wanted to talk about Forrester. I wanted to talk about so many of the names she was mentioning. These are the people that were here. These are the people that walked the streets. These are the people that hopefully didn't get too much water from the creek because it was the community sewer system. But there's some idea that in the midst of all of this, painfully evolving from the violence into the next decade from the decade of the 1860s, in the 1860s, the national tragedy of the Civil War and the more local droughts proved devastating for the meager population. One of the things I like to talk about now, and talk about the Civil War, was that we had an ironclad in San Francisco Bay. I won't talk about it, but I'd love to. So the Civil War doesn't affect California per se, although in our cemetery there are Confederate and Union veterans buried there. What it did, of course, is kind of puts the nation on a pause as this devastation occurs. And so the meager population here, the spirit is remarkably human, and it continues to cast despair behind, as in the words of Little Orphan Annie, the sun will come out tomorrow. And indeed, the sun, in both the sky and the hearts of men and women, led to the 1870s and beyond. In Marilyn's wonderful presentation, you know the community is populated by men and women and children intent on a better tomorrow. Challenged by the malfeasance of so many, awash in the greed and corruption endemic, especially in the political world. The small enclave along the Central Coast persevered with the determination that remains ageless and timely to all on earth. Just one key event in the 1870s to kind of highlight the challenge. The challenge to all names mentioned here was just a mention. It goes back to statehood. When California and Mexico ended their conflict and California became part of the nation, all land belonged to the federal government. To this day, vast amounts of this state are federal lands. They are federal territory. The 27 counties were recognized. The larger centers of population were recognized. But the small enclave of San Luis Obispo did not legally exist. Now, if you go back home and you've purchased any property, a home, a condominium, whatever, you own the land under it, or you're a poacher or a squatter. Okay, you need to own the land. The San Luis Obispo did not exist legally. What did this mean? Saga beyond time here. First, the community had to buy itself from the federal government for $1.25 an acre. Then, if you thought you owned property in the community, you had to petition the city. It wasn't a city at the time, it was a town. The town authorities, you had to petition them, and they granted you the land if there was no conflict. And one of the treasures that just sits in the City Hall vault are petitions from 1850s, 60s, mostly the 70s, of people asking the federal government, or the community government, to own the land. And one of them, and Marilyn mentioned, is Dr. Hayes with the petition for today's St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. Well worth much more time. But that gives you a little bit of an idea when you go home. You're not worried. You may be worried about paying the bill, the mortgage or the taxes, but you're not worried that the land under you doesn't belong to you. Because if you are, you need to do something about it real quick. Into this dynamic decade came the families and men who would form King David's Lodge. And quite often were the elected officials. I think Marilyn and I should have had something going. When she mentioned the name of a member of King David's Lodge, I should have raised my hand, and this is all I would have been doing. So they were very influential, very involved, very prominent, very much trying to create a community, trying to create an environment, trying to create a border to life that went beyond the violence of the 50s, went beyond the droughts and the discouragement of the 60s into the 70s. So let me just start, okay. Also into that environment came Leon Trousset. And I spent a great deal of time trying to track this man down. Remember, though in law, beyond a reasonable doubt? Not with Leon, very little. He's very elusive. He is very talented. He is very well represented in many galleries and so forth. And next month in the journal, I'm going to be, I've submitted it, will be a more of an involved article about Leon for you to hopefully get a copy and read. But Leon came in to San Luis Obispo, and we have two remembrances of his. One is displayed in the back. The view, it's called The View of San Luis Obispo. We know even less about that painting than we do about his magnificent George Washington. We know it hangs in the Mission Museum. I can assure you the Mission fathers at the time did not commission the painting. And most likely it was done and a donation, and of course the records. What's interesting about it, if it's up and you can look in the lower right hand corner, you're going to sort of see Leon Trousset. And guess what's under it? The date. And guess what happened? I'm positive it got wrapped around the frame. So we don't really know when that was painted. There are several clues along the way about Leon. And when you see it, it says 1870, Leon Trousset. He signs it twice. Now, why would an artist sign a painting twice? Well, 1870 also happens to be October 1870, the founding of this lodge. So I'm in court and you're the judge, and I'm going to present my evidence, and you decide. Not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not fantasy. But Leon was here. He was up and down the coast. He painted all kinds of things, sacred and secular work. One of his most famous paintings is at the Carmel Mission. Every history book of California almost that deals with missions will have that painting by Leon Trousset in it. For historians, the sound of the past is embedded in the plain bits of dust on any page called words. We try to hear the shouts, the laughter, the echoes of the past. We hopefully write so our readers will also hear the reverberations of the past and not just the silence of a document, a painting, or a grave. You'll start asking questions, and if you are really lucky, you'll start hearing some answers. You'll start asking the whys of life, of the person, of the painting, of the document, of the event. And if you're very fortunate, you'll hear some answers and not just read about it or look at it. For Slow in 1870, Marilyn has provided a splendid time capsule of remembrance, but you'll also see and hear the women consoling one another over the loss of yet another infant. Or the stone-faced men realizing their newborn child has not survived, but neither their wife. A wonderful imagination will go to the gathering, celebrating a birthday or anniversary, or even a civic accomplishment, such as having relatively clean water, or another structure being erected as another sign of progress. Can you imagine the pride when at King David's Lodge in October of 1870 was finally formed? Here were these men and their families. Here was a keystone accomplishment in the history of the community. And then 6 years later, George Washington is back celebrating the nation's centennial, which the Masons had a great deal to do with. In other words, while vastly different in today's visual world, Slow in 1870, indeed in any time, is populated by the same spirits, both kind and those not so kind, as those here today. Ultimately and finally, history in its vast, unlimited panorama of humanity resonates with the same themes as today. Hope and despair, good and evil, saints and sinners. It is all there and here at the same time. The month of September is replete with historic events. San Luis Obispo is the only community on earth that carries that name. San Luis Obispo is probably the 5th or 6th oldest community in California. It predates almost every other community. The mission was San Luis Obispo de Tolosa, was founded on September 1st, 1772, and a mere 78 years later, on September 9th, California became the 31st state in the Union in 1850. There is much more in between as I take, to speak, to write, to read. Today we try to more momentarily stop life's parade and examine just a bit of its knowing whatever our efforts, the parade will move on. Today, while we also remember in profound sorrow the events of 20 years ago, and recently the casualties in Afghanistan, we are also privileged to be part of the parade, celebrating a singular accomplishment for King David's Lodge, the unveiling of an incredibly important piece of art, and meeting a bit an elusive painter who we wish we could have met more intimately than today. Thank you.
So I'll tell you what, before we go on with the presentations from Shawn Eyer as well as Scott Haskins, more specifically about the painting, we're going to take a 15-minute break. There's some drinks out there. If you've never been in this building, the men's bathroom is to the right, the women's bathroom is to the left, but we will start back at about 20 past 3. Okay, so enjoy the short break and we'll see you soon. All right, welcome back, everybody. First of all, I wanted to thank our musical interludes by Dina Meyer. Perfect music for what we're doing, so thank you so much. And she's very much involved with Rainbow for Girls as well as Eastern Star. And she's a wonderful person, and I really appreciate her doing this for all of us. One comment I do want to make about what Joe was talking about and the question marks about Leanne Trousset being in this area. And it's very curious that you see pictures of Trousset in the mid-1860s up to 1869, and then 1875 you see him, and then there's a gap. There's a gap. And there's the one painting that's got the date rolled under, so the question mark is there. And the only one that's got any date at all is the one that you'll be seeing at 5 o'clock. We're not letting you see before that. That's what's going on. So without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Shawn Eyer, Worshipful Brother Shawn Eyer from the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. He was the one that got back to me within 30 minutes of seeing what I sent him by phone. So, Worshipful Shawn, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. In the beginning, I just want to say how glad I am to be back in California. I lived here for 16 years up in San Francisco. I've lived in DC now for 9 years. I love it there, but I love it here too. And what a pleasure it is to be back in the Golden State. Thank you, Worshipful Brother Clark and Worshipful Brother Bob, who I've become good friends with over the last basically 2 years. And to everyone who's part of the King David's Lodge family for making this happen today. I'm here, as Brother Bob said, on behalf of the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. And so I'm going to, I know some of you know all about the memorial, maybe some of you have been there, but most of you may not have had a chance to be there. It's a major element of our Masonic identity here in the United States. And so I'm going to start with an introduction to the memorial, what it's about, and what we're doing there. And then bridge that into what we're doing here today. Next slide, please. The vision of the memorial, and that's the building there in the background through the beautiful cherry trees. The vision of the memorial is to inspire humanity through education, to emulate and promote the virtues, character, and vision of George Washington, the man, the Mason, and the father of our country. Next slide. Now, often you'll see pictures of the memorial just sitting alone on a hill, but one of the things that I like to do as a photographer is I like to get out into the community and show the memorial from different angles. So this is me on, that's not me on that boat. I'm on a different boat taking this picture. And you can see in the background the George Washington Memorial. And this gives you a sense of the place of the presence of the memorial in the community of Alexandria, Virginia, which is just at the southern tip of the Beltway there in the DC area. You'll notice there's a scaffolding near the top of the memorial there. That's on our 8th floor, and that is when we were doing some major restoration of the tower masonry there. Next slide, please. So, George Washington is recognized throughout the fraternity as the foremost Freemason. He is an individual who had such an amazing effect upon the world, not just in the United States, but really, I mean, Washington is one of the most famous people in the world anywhere you go. And as many Masons know, he was part of the fraternity. He was initiated, cast, and raised in 1752 and 1753. Interestingly, he was raised rather young. He was 20 years old at a time when, under the rules of the Grand Lodge of England, the premier Grand Lodge, one would be 25 before one could be made a Mason. Now, his lodge that he joined in Fredericksburg was not under the Grand Lodge of England, so they may not have had a rule in that regard. But Washington would receive his first degree when he was 20. He was one of the first 5 initiates of the lodge at Fredericksburg. Next slide, please. And here is just a bust of Washington in the memorial. This is in one of our hallway areas, and he's wearing the jewel of a past master, which he had that rank as the titular master of Alexandria Lodge number 22. Next slide, please. Washington became well known as an attendee at Masonic events during and after the Revolution. This is a mural in the George Washington Memorial, an artistic representation of Washington as a Mason. You'll see he's wearing an apron here. You can't see the entire mural, but this depicts the Masons of Philadelphia attending Christ Church on the Feast of St. John the Evangelist, which was recognized that year on December 28, 1778, and this was the Masons of Philadelphia coming back together after being impeded by the British occupation of the city. Next slide, please. This is another mural we have in the George Washington Memorial in Alexandria, and this shows the 1793 cornerstone laying of the United States Capitol, with George Washington officiating and surrounded by hundreds of other Masons in their finest regalia. One of the things that we explain on our tours of the memorial is a little bit about the symbolism of the trowel. For those who are not familiar with some of the general metaphors of Freemasonry, we not only say that we use the tools of stonemasonry to shape ourselves, but we refer to ourselves as rough ashlars. Okay, are there rough ashlars here on display? Some rooms have them. Oh, they're hidden under the veil. Well, we're unveiling a painting and 2 ashlars. Okay, fantastic. So there's a Masonic mystery right now. So we have the metaphor of an individual as a stone. And just as you've heard the phrase that someone can have some rough edges, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. It's metaphorical that you would have rough edges. What does it matter if you have a rough edge? because the stone next to you might not fit so well, okay? And what if we have a whole society of people who are rough stones? We don't quite fit perfectly well together. We couldn't form a building, but the trowel is a symbol, we say it's a symbol of brotherly love. You could translate that into modern terms as a symbol of toleration, because you take a bunch of stones that are imperfect and you use the trowel to put cement that will unite them. The differences are still there. We're all still imperfect, the same as we were before, but they don't matter anymore because the trowel mediates that. So we say we must spread the cement of brotherly love and affection. So Washington holding a trowel here, it's very symbolic of how they were bringing the states together into the United States. And they were going to become tolerant of people having different religions, different political perspectives, and so on. Next slide, please. Now, when they decided in 1910, the Masonic leaders of the United States gathered in Alexandria, and they determined that their mission was to erect and maintain in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, a suitable memorial temple to George Washington the Mason. And I think that is, they had a flair for understatement, because they did not just build a suitable memorial temple, they really built a masterpiece, in my humble opinion. Next slide, please. And, you know, there it is, suitable. Okay, I mean, that is an amazing structure. I think just about anybody would agree. World class. It's 333 feet tall from its base, and it's up on a hill. So it really towers over the entire region. And one of the things I love hearing from people who are native Alexandrians is whenever they see it coming into view in the distance, they know they're home. It's a symbol of home for people who live there. Next slide. Inside the memorial's main hall, which we call Memorial Hall, there's a spectacular statue of Washington by the English-born sculptor Bryant Baker. This was executed in 1949 and then installed in 1950 on Washington's birthday, February 22nd, dedicated by President Harry Truman, who was past Grand Master of Masons, as many of you know, in the state of Missouri. Next slide, please. Now, at the memorial today, many people are very pleased to know that under normal circumstances, not during COVID, right? We've been open and closed and open and closed. Right now, we happen to be closed. But under normal circumstances, we're open 7 days a week and from 9 to 5 for Masons and the public and anyone who wants to come in to have a tour and learn a lot about what Washington's participation in Freemasonry has meant, and also they learn a little bit about what we call the Masonic family. Next slide, please. Here's an image of the large statue of Washington with the sculptor in it there on the left, and then on the right you can see one of our tour groups looking at the statue and also listening to a little bit about the symbolism of why Masons wear aprons. Next slide, please. This is a room within the memorial that we call the replica lodge room, and I wish I had a way to zoom in on the painting there. That is the original of the 1794 William Joseph Williams portrait of Washington as a Mason. You can probably just make out he's got a Masonic apron on there. That is the only Masonic portrait of Washington that was done during his lifetime. So Washington sat for that portrait. Next slide, please. Here's an example of that you can really see the presence of that statue in the main hall of the memorial. And this is taken during one of our Washington's birthday galas. We had to not hold that, of course, in 2021. But we're hoping that we'll be able to hold it in 2022, next February. Next slide. This is an educational event that we hold almost every year, barring COVID, called the George Washington Symposium, free and open to the public. Next slide, please. And this is just an image of our gala dinner, which we have after all of the other festivities on that night. Next slide. In 2015, I'm happy to say that the memorial was officially denominated a National Historic Landmark, and this is just a picture of that event taking place. Next slide. This is a close-up of the scaffolding that we had up when we were doing the external stonework, and you can just get a sense of the scale of the building from that. Next slide. And this is a close-up of our operative masons that is just outside the observation deck. If you've ever been to the memorial, he's actually on the outside of the cage surrounding the observation deck, and I guess so was I, because I took the picture. Next slide. And here they are repairing cracks in the stone. Next slide, please. Next slide. And next slide. Now, we had our own restoration project a few years ago involving a George Washington painting. This is a close-up of the one that I mentioned a little bit earlier, the 1793 cornerstone laying mural. We looked up and we saw some damage, really not just there, but all the way across the painting, like a almost 30-foot line. It looked like a rip, and that's exactly what it was. The wall behind it was kind of giving way and pushing against the canvas, literally tearing it in half. Next slide. That's a close-up. You can see the fibers pulling away and the pigment falling off the canvas. Next slide. So restoration began. It was a massive task. The mural had to be detached from the wall, taken off-site, and then the wall had to be rebuilt. Next slide. And this just shows you the scale of that project. Next slide, please. There's something you don't see every day. The mural's down on the floor of the memorial prior to being rolled up and taken out. Next slide. And there it is, basically 2/3 gone. Next slide. One of the other things that we've done is we've been working on fixing the memorial, restoring the memorial to its original glory. We've also been upgrading the lighting system. These are LED light fixtures up on the tower. Next slide. And you can see, we often, if you look on our Facebook page and other places, you'll see we have the ability to light the building now in all kinds of different colors. And this has been a major way of drawing renewed attention to the memorial and its mission. Next slide, please. There are other statues of Washington throughout the building. This is not a Masonic sculpture of Washington, because you don't see he's wearing an apron or any Masonic regalia. However, this sculpture was made by a Mason. The famous French sculptor Houdon came to America after the Revolution, spent time with Washington at Mount Vernon, and this was sculpted in marble. That's a bronze casting of it. Okay. Next slide. This is the artist's original concept of what the Memorial Hall interior would look like. Next slide. And we'll skip this. Next slide, please. One of the things that we've done is we've taken the stained glass, which was installed later, and we got it back to what you see there in the original drawing. Next slide. Next slide. And so that's what the memorial looks like now. So there's more light, people can really see the murals, and that's what we want to do. We wanted to shed light on the murals for their educational value and restore the building to what the architect had originally intended. Next slide. And I want to invite all of you to our centennial of our cornerstone. February 20th, 2023, we'll celebrate the 100th anniversary of the cornerstone being laid for the memorial. When it happened in 1923, it was a national scale Masonic event. And we're hoping that the same thing will be true in 2023. Next slide. Here you see that event. That's the cornerstone being lowered into place. Next slide, please. And there's another view of it. Next slide. Here's a view from the air of that cornerstone being laid. Next slide. The George Washington Masonic National Memorial is many things. It's a museum. It's a very important community center. It's a center for the arts. I consider it to be the ultimate expression of our American Masonic heritage, and I want to tell you it's a great privilege to be part of the memorial's staff and to be able on behalf of all of us at the memorial, to extend our gratitude to King David's Lodge for doing its part to protect the American Masonic heritage in the form of what this lodge has had really all throughout its history, and bringing that back into the foreground by means of this event. So, I also want to let you know of something very exciting before I leave the topic of the memorial strictly. Our curator, Mark Tabbert, many of you have heard of him. He's written a number of very interesting books. He has a new book that's going to be coming out next year called A Deserving Brother, George Washington and Freemasonry. Okay? This is published by the University of Virginia Press in partnership with the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, and it will be the definitive account of Washington's history with the Masonic fraternity. And I hope that you'll visit our website where you can find out how to pre-order a copy of it. It's guaranteed to be extremely illuminating. I've seen sections of the book and I find it to be very, very worthwhile and impressive. So, I was so pleased when I think the very first thing I heard about this painting that you have was from Most Worshipful Brother Shawn Eyer. I got an email from him right around, maybe the same day I got an email from Bob. And it was just, the coronavirus pandemic was happening, none of us knew it yet. Remember that time period? Yeah, we didn't know, but it was around, and things are about to really change. But this restoration that the Lodge has spearheaded has happened in an unusual time, but it's a blessing that at least we're all back. We're all able to at least come here and be together for this unveiling. I mentioned a little bit ago the 1794 William Joseph Williams portrait of Washington. In that picture, I believe Washington sat for that image when he was 62 years old, and that was at the request of Lodge number 22 of Alexandria. That is where in 1788 and 1789 Washington is on the charter. He's the charter master of the lodge. Now, what the research that Brother Mark Tabbert has done and verified has shown that Washington did not actually preside over the lodge during that time. He was President of the United States. He had other things that was going on. But he was honored. It was kind of an honorary title that the lodge chose to give to him, and they commissioned a portrait to commemorate that. So that was the first Masonic portrait of Washington. Now the other, probably the most famous Masonic picture of Washington, I've seen at least 2 copies of it here in this building. There might be more tucked away, and maybe you can picture the one. You find it in almost every lodge across the country. That was painted by Hattie Burdett, okay, in 1932 for the bicentennial celebration of George Washington's birth, okay? And then copies were given not just to lodges, but all kinds of groups, and it's the Masons who mostly retained it. Interestingly enough, it happened to be, it was a Masonic portrait, and there's a lot of interesting information about how that picture came to be. Now, what's fascinating to me about the Trousset is that chronologically, it's just about at the center point between the William Joseph Williams Masonic portrait of Washington, which Washington sat for, right? The living Masonic portrait of Washington. And then the really famous 1932 Masonic visualization of Washington as master of the lodge, which dominated the way we think of Washington in a Masonic context since that part of the 20th century, and just because that picture is everywhere. The Trousset is right in the middle of that, and when we look at the context of it in 1870, that's just 5 years after the end of the American Civil War. So when you think about it, a picture of Washington as a Mason, painted in 1870, the context of it, it would reflect kind of a return to that stability and unity that we saw as a nation as we began the process of healing from that terrible conflict. Moreover, for Masons, it's a symbol of how deeply the Masonic heritage is interwoven with the values and history of our nation. And those who are familiar with Masonic philosophy often reflect on the idea that it may be that the general religious toleration of the United States was inspired to some degree by the fact that that religious toleration was first modeled in the Masonic Lodge. That's something historians debate. It seems to me a pretty valid observation. And there are many other examples of ways in which Masonic values seem to be infused in the American experiment. So, in conclusion, from Alexandria, Virginia, where Washington lived and worked and has a grand monument erected to him in the form of the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, to here on the Pacific Coast in San Luis Obispo, where Leon Trousset painted a Masonic portrait of Washington for your lodge. From sea to shining sea, Masons then and now recognize the importance of George Washington, the man, the Mason, and the father of our country. George Washington's Masonic legacy lives on here in this beautiful lodge, and King David's Lodge is part of that grand Masonic tradition of recognizing the importance of what came before, what is now, and must ever be. So thank you all very kindly.
Want to go on a field trip in 2023? Last presentation we're going to have right now is with the man who actually is responsible for conserving this painting. And what happened was that after King David's, we voted on getting it conserved. The thought was, well, Shawn had talked about us sending it to DC, but when we found out that the Santa Barbara Lodge had used a local conservator, Scott's Fine Arts Conservation Laboratories in Santa Barbara, Worshipful Brother Peter Champion and I got in the car and took the painting out of the vault, put it in the back of a car and drove it down, and we showed it. Scott was able to be there and take a look at it, and we said, okay, here you go. And we were thinking at that time that we might do that for the sesquicentennial last year. And then it became obvious that that was going to be a virtual event. And so we just told Scott, take your time. So that's what happened, and I think I'm just going to turn it over to Scott and let him explain the process. So Scott Haskins from the Fine Art Conservation Laboratories.
Good afternoon. Good to be here with you today. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity and the privilege of being connected with your organization. We've loved and I appreciate greatly the opportunity to work with and have appreciated working with other Masonic organizations over the decades, and I'll say another thing about that also. If you come up and see me afterwards, I am not a person that wears eyeshadow. Not that kind of guy. I had an accident and there was some reconstructive reconstructive surgery required, the doctor thought I would be clear and ready to be presentable, but today I come to you looking like a raccoon, kind of. So please excuse the bruised appearance. I have been working on, I have been dedicated to the preservation and restoration of paintings since 1975. I studied in Italy, and the first painting I ever worked on was in an 800-year-old monastery on a painting that was dated 1365 in northern Italy. And then, so coming back to the United States, of course, there are not very many paintings from 1365 or monasteries that are 800 years old. But right from the very beginning, working on historical paintings and working on significant artwork has been a great, great pleasure of my life. One of the questions I get often and is this painting worth it? Is it worth restoring? And I, today, from the conversations and the presentations, I think it's amazing that you have this portrait of George Washington. Amazing, because if you look at San Luis Obispo in 1870, this was a two-horse town that was in political upheaval. They were trying to figure out, they were just, they didn't have anything going for them. They were trying to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, and look at the place they built to represent their community and for the Masons to come together. This represented this dedication to God and country. Was what is represented in this building was a humongous contrast to the Wild Wild West. This was a dedication to principles that should be alive and living today in our country and are compromised. But yet within their poverty, or within, I should say, within their dedication to quality, and this incredible building that they built in this two-horse town, they also spent the money for, they were looking for something of quality. They were looking for an image that would represent Freemasonry, that would also represent the quality and their commitments. And for them to find an artist that could come together, that could put together and could make a painting like this was a real commitment on their part. Also, a bit of fortunate events probably came together for them to be able to find him, the artist, to be able to do this, because we have worked on many paintings. Our laboratory is responsible for the preservation and the restoration of the national treasures of California, which include the paintings by Henry Chapman Ford of all of the missions of California, the entire set of missions of California before their restoration took place. They were done between 1874 and 1886, and other missions. We just completed a backdrop. And could be, I haven't done the research, but it could be the oldest painting in the state of California. It was painted as part of the construction of the Santa Barbara Mission. And so the fact that this painting in 1870 and of this subject matter with this connection on a national level, when this, California was not part of a national vibe. It was way out west. I mean, it was a detached, it was like being on another planet. And it took you about as long to get to as it does today to get to another planet. And so the fact that you own this painting, the fact that you have this quality of painting in your collection is it goes way beyond anything of monetary value. It has zero monetary value because you can't replace it. You can't buy another one. And so it's a great honor on our part and to be included and to be trusted in its preservation and restoration. I'm here today to share with you the process that we went through quickly and show you how the steps that we took to make this happen. So if we can go ahead. Unfortunately, my PowerPoint has video clips in it, and that doesn't work with the version of PowerPoint you have. So you're not going to get the video clips. But if you'll go ahead and move forward, I'll explain these as we move along. I hope we move along. Oh, there we go. Okay. So here we have the painting arriving at the lab. Our lab is 10,000 square feet. And we work on about 500 paintings a year. We work on easel paintings like yours, but we also work on murals all over the United States, and in fact have two consultation projects going on in northern Italy right now. But we've got various very interesting projects going on. Next, please. So the painting was not a train wreck, meaning it wasn't in horrible condition, but it has a backing on it. It had a backing on it that was I've never seen before. It looked like it was a painted window shade, and I've seen window shades used for backing and strengthening the backs of paintings before, but this was really quite different. And you can see underneath the eye on the apron, you can see that there's about an 8 or 10 inch rip there that occurred. At this point, we hadn't, well, that was the major damage on it, which is right by the eye. Go ahead, next. So we began assessing. First of all, when we assess something, we look at all the details of it under a microscope, and we do solubility tests. You can see that this additional fabric that was glued to the back of the original wasn't put on very evenly. You can see how it had gathers in it and wrinkles in it. Those do not show up on the front. But still, we had to deal with this because our treatments would have then compounded this problem and would not have been good for long-term preservation. So long-term preservation was our first worry. That is completely separate from our task of restoring it. Preserving it means that it will last in stable, good condition for generations to come, but it could be preserved and still look awful. And so, preserved chemically and structurally, it could look, it would move, it could be preserved for generations, but it could still look awful. So our first important thing is that we wanted to preserve it, and then we would look at the restoration. So next slide, please. So interestingly, there was a big rip. This big rip that was by the eye had been patched on the back with mattress ticking, and someone had carved up their mattress in order to, you can see it has the blue lines across it, which is typical of mattresses at the turn of the 20th century. Go ahead, next. And then as we peeled off that, you can see that there was a hole left in the painting, and we're scraping off the adhesive. It was a kind of a brutal and slow process to do it safely. Go ahead, next. And then after we were able to clean up the back of it and get it evened out and smooth, then we absorbed into the structure of the painting from the front and the back adhesives that are conservation quality and that are chosen for deep penetration. Then we add a little bit of heat to that, and that heat encourages it to penetrate a little deeper. This video would have showed you that this table, what we do on this table heats up, and then we have a plastic sheeting that goes over the top that just holds things in place. So we pull the air out of it and it sucks down. And so I was going to show you how that works, but we're not going to, of course. Next. Okay, so here we're letting it kind of percolate and kind of like being in a jacuzzi. It just kind of sits there and relaxes and flattens out and feels good. And of course, we're not anywhere near any temperature or anything that would be damaging to the painting. Next. So after stabilizing the condition, then we put it back on its stretcher bars, and the artwork still looks really rough and unrestored. However, now it is stable, and it could be stable. I have a painting, for instance, at the lab that got wet in I think in the Montecito mudslides, and the canvas shrunk, and all the paint came popping off of it. It was a painting probably done about 1900 of some hunting dogs. And so once we reattached all that paint and got everything back down, it still looked like it had been dragged through the streets by horses or something. It was really awful looking, but it'll still hold together and be stable for another 100 years. So that's kind of where we are here in this slide. Next slide. So underneath the microscope, we test our cleaning colors, our cleaning solvents, we mix them specially. We don't buy anything from Home Depot, we don't hit anything with a mop. And we look at all the different colors and how the artist layered his paint, and we make sure that nothing that we do either changes or dissolves or alters in any way what we're doing. Next, please. So this was going to show you a cleaning, and the technique of that is a Q-tip. You can see there, we roll our home, by the way. Our Q-tip right there at the top, and we would be rolling that across the surface, not be scrubbing it. And then you would see the yellow varnish letting go and coming off right in the area of the eye. But anyway, you'll have to imagine that. Okay. Next, please. So you can see, though, the difference in that yellow look, and instead here you're looking at a whiter look. This looks different on your screen than it does on my computer screen. But right down the middle of each of those legs, you can see that one side looks dark and one side looks a little lighter, and I was showing, and it was a little clearer about the difference in cleaning and the removal of the grime and the yellow varnish and how those original colors came back. Go ahead, next. So this was going to be a slideshow, and there was going to be a magical wave of the hand, and you were going to see George be cleaned in a matter of seconds, but that's not happening. So next. So after cleaning, what we did in cleaning, we took off all the grime and the discolored varnish, and we also took off all the previous retouchings because they were not done well, they were discolored and were not respectful in some ways. So we got all of those off, and then we went back and we were using a very, very small brush. We use colors that are made specifically for the restoration of artwork. We don't even have a tube of oil paint in the lab, because oil paint gets rock hard with time, and then you can't get it off without damaging the artwork. Plus it shifts in color, and also acrylic colors like you would buy at the art store don't work. So anyway, our efforts are always to use. Are we okay? All right. Maybe I'm too loud. That's why you're getting some backup. All right. All right. So what we use stays exactly. I've seen paintings that I had painted 50 years ago, and they are exactly the right color still today. And but if I were to take a solvent today and just rub it over the top of those 50-year-old retouchings, they'd come off in a second. and with no damage whatsoever to the artwork. This concept of reversibility is important when we're respecting the historical nature and original nature of the artwork. So we know that, let's say there were a fire or they were to be damaged some way, then the next restoration or conservation process could easily get into it without having to wrestle with all of these things that, there's artists or restorers that think that they need to put something in that's just like ironclad, it's going to last forever. Well, that means that you can't help it the next time without having to deal with this ironclad cement that you can't get off. And it makes the project much more difficult. Next slide, please. So let's see. So, okay, next slide is. All right, well here we are. We've finished it. It's back in its original frame. And Virginia Panazon is the other art conservator. There are actually 3 art conservators that we have in the lab with decades and decades of experience. And it was a wonderful project for us. We enjoyed having George in the lab for some extended time, and it was a real privilege to have him there. You'll get to see the finished project here in a minute. Next. So we were very honored to be entrusted with this, and some people ask, whether what if it could be done cheaper or those kinds of things, but it really takes a certain amount of effort to do it right. And of course, George deserved to have it done right. But even if it were your great-grandmother's portrait that got ripped, we would not treat her we would not clean her with the mop and slap her together with duct tape. She would be done correctly because we would want her to look good for your great-great-grandchildren. And so the idea of, our profession is not a construction trade. We do not have a contractor's license that the state issues us. We provide professional services that take into consideration all of the values that were important to you when you were looking to have George last for generations to come and to look his best from a historical point of view. That he now looks perfect historically. Everything blends in and is a perfect representation not only of the Masons, but also of that time period and that history. Next one. Yeah. Well, like I said, we've worked before with other Masonic temples and organizations. This is a magnificent painting of the departure of the Israelites from Egypt, meaning the liberation of a nation, and was one of 7 paintings that Emmanuel Lutze did in about 1850 to represent the freedom in the United States and the struggle for freedom. And this was a magnificent project that we enjoyed doing. Next. And then we've also, you'll notice there the top photograph is the lodge in Santa Barbara, and the one on the right is in Salt Lake City, and the one on the left is Masonic Lodge in Pasadena that we've done work for. We, in Santa Barbara, we cataloged everything, every historical object as part of their collection. We got it in a catalog and got it documented so that it was, so that everything was accounted for. Is there another one? We're at the end. So again, thank you very much for the honor and the pleasure and the privilege of working with your organization and for letting us work on this portrait that we loved having so much. And we appreciate very much your efforts and all that you stand for and all that you promote in our communities, and appreciate very much the opportunity to be a part of that in some way.
Just to let everybody know that one of the things that was going to be here today was a commemorative book that was, this is the cover of it. But of course, everything is delayed in these time periods, so we thought we had it in on time. But later on, if you're interested in getting a copy of it, just come up and just let me know, and we'll work it out. But it's it has the presentations that Joe did, Marilyn did, not the one of Shawn's, but Jim Moore, who did a lot in terms of the different aprons with respect to the various portraits of Washington. That's in there, plus also the article that was from the Freemason magazine as well as the before and after. And there's various pictures. Pete Ivey from Freemason magazine went down to Fine Arts Conservation Laboratories and took a bunch of pictures. So some of those pictures are in that book as well. So just let me know afterwards. What I wanted to do now is I wanted to invite all four of you, Shawn, Scott, Joe, and Marilyn, to come and sit up and for people to be able to ask questions, but also maybe there could be a discussion that ensues. But I'm wanting to have it so that you that have been watching all of these presentations get a chance to just ask questions. So if I could invite you all up, these chairs are for you. You have a question? Go ahead.
I had a question for the restoration. You said you didn't use oil or acrylics. What type of pigment or color?
It's an acrylic paint, but it's the resins are solvent based. They're not like the water-based acrylics that you have from the store. So they come in a variety of different kinds of resins. The resins that are used for the pigment are chosen for their stability and the fact that they don't discolor with time, that they stay reversible, that kind of thing. But they're made specifically for our purposes.
Joe and Marilyn, as Joe said, there wasn't much that we know about Trousset, but we do know that he traveled around the Southwest and into Mexico. Were you able to trace his travels?
The only way with Trousset, if that indeed was his real name, is to trace the paintings and the dates that were on the paintings. And one of the paintings they found was misdated. So that's the only record, very little in print. There is no record in Masonic minutes that Robert has read of the event. There's no record in the newspaper of his being here, which is extremely interesting because in 1870, Walter Murray, who was going to be a founder of the lodge, was the owner-editor, or the editor, let's put it. So Trousset becomes a ghost, and only through his works do we find where he was. And what's going to happen next month in the journal is just as soon as you think you've got Leon someplace, another date shows up. So he is very interested. He was not interested in history. He was interested in painting and making money.
So we don't know anything about where he was born, when he was born?
Oh, yes, we only know where he was born, when he was born by his death certificate. And there's some very good scholarly work online that has the wrong dates because the death certificate was more recently found. They think he was born in France, and fascinating connection, as far as I'm concerned, between his being a French speaking, Spanish speaking, English speaking fella here in San Luis Obispo with the Dalades, with the Sandy, well, another story, but the artist in the Dalade family. So there's much more, so I'll apply for a $500,000 fellowship from someplace and try to find it. But right now, a couple of things are going to happen, I hope. And number one is the picture of San Luis Obispo. The view of San Luis Obispo will be taken out of this frame. And hope there might be a date. That happened with the painting in the Mission of St. Louis. When it was recently restored, all of a sudden, here came the artists and so forth. The other is there's some reference to him being paid. And hopefully we find where that reference is and the date and so forth. I think those two would be very important to getting up. But as I said, it doesn't matter when this painting was done. But the curiosity of history is there.
Just to add to that, what Joe's saying, and I was mentioning this to another brother earlier this afternoon. The one gentleman that couldn't come was Jim Moore from the Albuquerque Museum. And they, at the Albuquerque Museum, has Troussets in the museum, which is why he was really curious about it. And what he had done some research, and what he found was that historically in the United States, a lot of art galleries as well as art institutes were initiated by Masons all over the country. And one of the things that was known by itinerant artists that were traveling is if you could find where there was a Masonic lodge, and you could find out where the Masons hung out, you could probably get some commissions. So we do know that there's a relationship between Leon Trousset and Walter Murray. What Joe is referring to is a brother did find a reference, and I don't know, this is Dave Chesborough. I don't know if you remember where Peter said he found that, but the amount was $178. And, but Peter doesn't remember exactly where. Yeah, it was there, it was elusive, and it disappeared again. But the idea was it's the equivalent of about $3,500 today. And the reason why, I mean, I've gone through the minutes of the lodge from 1870 to about 1875, because the thought was that maybe this was done a little bit later, but it was, and then it was just written down as 1870. There's no mention. And so we surmise that more than likely it was just a private commission. That one of the guys that was starting King David's, because what happened was that it was at the death of Alexander Murray, who was the saloon keeper and the general store person, that all these guys came together, that Marilyn had the told you all about. They came together to decide to create King David's. And maybe sitting next to them was a guy drinking a whiskey by the name of Leon Trousset and said, hey, I know you guys really like Washington's. You want me to paint? So we don't know exactly what the story is, but I like to fantasize that Trousset had a good time when he was in San Luis Obispo.
No, there's no question that Leon painted. And there's so many fascinating questions. Today, we have a record in Tucson, Arizona. He's there. And today we said, well, we'll just get in the plane or we'll get in the car and back and forth. But just think of how Leon got from Tucson to San Luis or San Francisco or anywhere.
it really provides more than art history. There's human history here. And so part of that would be wonderful. And again, when I was making my comments about law and about historians, I'm really using a lot of maybes in October's article. There's a lot of suppositions and maybes. But the idea being, as at least we know about him in this community, he's very famous in the art world as this magnificent restoration.
My question is about the Washington Memorial. I have a calendar in my office. It's a George Washington calendar. And I would have swore, looking at it last week, it had a couple of important dates on it that are happening next week. And one was the commemoration of the laying of the cornerstone. And yet you announced this big celebration that they're having in 2023 that's on February 23rd. So what am I confused about here?
Thank you very much for that question. We chose February of 2023 for the commemoration because the Conference of Grand Masters of North America will be held in our area at that time. That means that all of the Grand Masters and many of the other Grand Lodge officers will already be present in the area, and it makes the event much easier to hold because you have a critical mass of Masonic leadership who are already present and would not be making 2 trips to the same place the same year, etc. And we worked hard to get this on the calendar of the collective Grand Masters several years ago. So it coincides with the Conference of Grand Masters and also roughly correlates with Washington's birthday, which is February 22nd. So it will be a celebration of Washington's birthday. It will be a celebration of, the year of the centennial, if not the actual day of the centennial of the Cornerstone. Thank you.
Great. I've been dying to go visit the Washington Memorial, and I'm just thinking that this time would be a great opportunity to go visit when there's such a grand celebration going on.
Yes, and we really hope to see you there. And I hope you enjoy the calendar. That was a fun project that we were able to do last year.
I was interested in the American Revolution, and wasn't there Masonic lodges in all of the 13 colonies? And did this have a very important reason why the American Revolution succeeded?
Well, thank you for that question. Certainly, there has been some historic research about this. There's an excellent book called Revolutionary Brotherhood by a historian named Stephen Bullock, which I think is some of the best research that you can read about the influence of Freemasonry during and in the years after the Revolution. Many of the leaders of the Revolution were part of the Masonic fraternity, and I would say, in my view, that the values of Freemasonry were at the forefront of many of their ideas. Yes, thank you.
I have a question. I think when we unveil this painting, one of the things that I find extremely interesting about it is it's one of the few George Washington Masonic paintings where he is actually armed. He's got a sword at his waist, which is a very unusual thing to see a Mason in Masonic regalia armed. As a matter of fact, I don't even think I've ever seen it before. Is that a fair statement to make, that we don't have that? And if so, and that brings me back to Trousset being a Frenchman, who the French, especially at that time, totally revered George Washington, not only as a warrior, but also as a Mason. Is it thinking something, I'm just trying to figure out where that actually came from. If that's a possibility, that it's just an interpretation from a French artist that he recognized with the Mason and the warrior at the same time.
That question, in my mind, if you're asking me, I would say it calls to mind the practice of some continental lodges where members would, not just the timer of the lodge, but other members of the lodge would have swords and use them during the initiation process. Okay? I don't actually think that that's what's happening in the painting. I don't have any way of even beginning to address the question of whether Trousset could have been a Mason before he left his native country, right? It doesn't, right? I mean, if we knew that he was a member of a French lodge, then we would start to put some things together there, right? But I would just say that he's being shown in his uniform in this painting. He's being shown in his uniform. Part of his uniform is the sword, and then it's simply enriched with his Masonic identity in the form of a master's jewel and a Masonic apron. Interesting question.
Well, my question was kind of related to that, and just what his inspiration would have been to make that image, because right, you wouldn't have met George Washington. So how would he have based the look of George Washington? What might have been his inspiration?
Well, as little as we know, obviously he didn't meet George Washington. He would have painted from a lithograph. That's why I need this $250,000 grant to go researching what lithographs were available of George Washington around 1870 in California, or possibly, and you would have to bridge it, between 1870 and 1876. And that indeed may be a serious clue as to when he painted, because if a lithograph or illustration of some sort was not available anywhere until 1873, for instance, then we could pinpoint a better date on it. I think, but again, no matter when it was painted, you know, it's just a magnificent remembrance of the past. But the historian in me, I want to join Leon when he's painting it. And that's not possible right now.
I have a question for the restorers. Had you restored any other Trousset paintings?
I don't believe we have.
And was there anything particular about the painting that would, a unique technique or material or brush strokes or anything that would stand out to your eye?
No, we've worked on lots of paintings. I've worked on lots of paintings in my career from itinerant artists. They were pretty common, and both those that just circulated in the East, but then, of course, much more common once the railroad was connected in Ogden. And so they, you know, all they had to do was buy a ticket to get out here. And so, the materials that they had often were scavenged or salvaged. And so, like I said, painting on the back of a window blind or on a mattress cover or on irrigation duct or whatever they could find was pretty common. And you know, the stretcher bars that they had on the back were, you know, no great, you know, were not any better. and quality. But the technique was pretty straightforward. The techniques, unless you got into high society and you have lots of choices from industry, starting from about 1800, the techniques could be, the technique of the artist was pretty traditional.
Do you know of any compendiums of itinerant painters that came through California?
Compendium, what do you mean by compendium?
Well, any list of itinerant painters that
I know.
coming up and down the coast? That would be an interesting study. That's your study.
Well, online there actually was, Trousset was actually in Monterey. He was in a conclave of artists there. So I mean, it's not that far.
Yeah.
But the timing was, again, different.
Based upon, again, I like the law analogy. If you're going to go in front of a judge and try to plead your case, it can't be, well, it might be in here, and it could be there, and it might be there. So the law in me tries to tack it down. And it was extremely frustrating. I read whatever I could, and hopefully more will come. And they aren't really sure when he was born. They say he was born in France, but they don't know where. They're not sure when he got to the Americas. They talk about the French invasion of Mexico, which kind of makes a little sense, because if he was a part of the French army invading Mexico and they were defeated and Maximilian was shot, then he would disappear as fast as he could from Mexico City. And so he shows up at the United States border. He's very much back and forth. So there's lots of suppositions. And for me, part of me, I'm trying to feel like Leon. I'm trying to see what he's up to, And I start my article that way. He's trying to make a living. And so the itinerant painters would very much so populate much of America. There weren't salons, which would hire a Rembrandt or hire a Da Vinci to do portraits. And so you made a living that way, literally made a living. You painted and you got dinner, or you got a horse or something.
A comment about artists on the West Coast in general. You might want to remember that the painting the West, and particularly California, because of the topography, because of how beautiful the Yosemite and places like this were. We were drawing artists, and so being here and being fluid about it is very, very.
Very popular.
Yeah.
Very popular. The Trousset guy, when he's here, that we can verify, he's painting all kinds of things for the church. One of his most famous paintings is at the Carmel Mission. That's the first place I saw him. So he's painting for the church, he's painting for the secular society, he's painting for the community. He does pictures of Hidalgo in Mexico. He's very eclectic in his known works, his known capacity. And so taking on the challenge of George Washington, because this was not an easy painting to do. His client, whoever that client happened to be, had a vision of George Washington as a Mason. And Trousset I think, accomplished it. I don't know what the vision was, but it's magnificent.
I think as a segue into us revealing this, that was pretty good. So I'll tell you what, it's a little bit early, I don't mind. I would invite Worshipful Brother Shawn and Worshipful Brother Worshipful Dean, to stand on either side. Christian's setting up his camera, so we're going to get this. This is the moment. And what we'd like you to do is hold on one side and the other. And you're going to just snap it over. And the two of you.
Give me a heart attack.
So here is the moment.
Wait.